So, how do we develop the skill of tolerating that piece? I have several kids who part of the sleep plan that we have in place is tolerating not being Velcro to their mother, because how can we fall asleep on our own if mom is always stuck in the bed, right? We want to get to sleep on our own. So part of that is being able to tolerate time away, and we can't just do that at night because it's quite frankly unfair. Like, we're Velcroed all day long, but at night in the dark, I'm not with you anymore, and that just increases anxiety for a couple of my learners. So we work during the day to practice the skill of, I'm going to be right back, hang out, and I'm going to leave. And then I teach parents to do that in short intervals and to come back and reinforce the behavior of being able to be okay for a few seconds, a few minutes without mom.
What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the All About Kids podcast. This time, I sit down with Gabrielle Carmody. Gabrielle is a BCBA and sleep specialist dedicated to helping children on the spectrum improve their sleep. On this episode, we get into what drew Gabrielle into the world of BCBAs and sleep. We discuss the key elements of creating a bedtime routine for a child with autism, common mistakes parents make when getting their kids ready for bed, the importance of setting events, the biggest misconceptions about sleep hygiene, and more. You can find Gabrielle Carmody at @sleeptight_Gabby and also at Gabrielle Carmody on YouTube, where you'll see all of the resources we discussed during this conversation. Without further ado, please enjoy this wide-ranging, deep-diving episode with Gabrielle Carmody. Gabrielle Carmody, thank you for joining me on the All About Kids podcast.
You're more than welcome.
How did you get into becoming a BCBA and sleep specialist? What drew you into that path?
Well, I actually started in the field when I was about 19. So initially, so many years ago, I started off as like a TA and then worked myself up to a special ed teacher, and then eventually became a BCBA in the field. Fast forward several years later, I'm working with a family who has two sets of twins, with one set having significant sleep issues. And I just didn't feel capable to remediate what was happening. So I started to do research on my own to really just investigate a little bit more the behavioral techniques, understanding a little bit better the concept of sleep, how it was affecting my learners, and then trying to parlay that into what I already knew in terms of the scope of my practice. So that's how I kind of chose the path, or kind of
Yeah.
fell into the path, so to say. Um, that was what kicked it off. Then when I learned about the impact of sleep, which you kind of already know just as being a human, you know that you don't sleep well, you don't do good. But then to really take the coursework or the certification course to understand how impactful that setting event really is and how much we don't pay attention to it, was a little bit eye-opening, because at the time I wasn't aware that 80% or up to 80% of children on the spectrum can suffer with sleep challenges. So when you hear that number, if you heard 80% of anything, you would be
Yeah.
addressed.
Yeah, that's a big problem, 4 out of 5.
Yeah, it's a big problem. So how do we do better as practitioners to help families? And that's really kind of what then spearheaded my interest into just disseminating the information and helping other practitioners do better at that.
Hmm. So to go back to that case, to revisit it, where you said you were encountering some sleep problems with a child, didn't feel like you had the necessary resources or the knowledge base at the time to tackle it. Was there any sort of special moment or something that happened during that case where you sort of latched onto that and said, this changed my path. I'm going into this, because I'm sure you encountered a lot of different cases in BCBA field. There's so many different directions you could go. Was there any special moment about that case that you can remember?
Yeah, the twins that I work with, they are very dear to me. I've been with the family for now going on 8 years, and there was just this sensation that, they're struggling, and if I can't help them in all aspects, or at least make a dent, what will their outcome be? So it was really the case itself was so complex, and there's a lot of medical issues with the girls that kind of were the catalyst for this kind of path that I started taking that really were impacting their sleep as well, on top of skill deficits, on top of other issues. So I remember that the woman, Emily Varon, who I did my certification with, was like, "You might not wanna start with the most complex case on your caseload." And that was kind of like
Yeah.
her advice to me because there was a lot to unravel, but that twin the twins were really what drove me to try and do better because they were just had so many needs.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just wanna say that when I was going through your YouTube channel, which is so valuable, and we'll get into some of the specifics of the sleep hygiene and sleep habits, but something that kept popping back into my head when I was going through it is that as someone who's neurotypical, I took sleep for granted. Like I never had problems sleeping as a kid. I had, some bouts with insomnia like every working adult does, but I never really had like a consistent years long battle with going to sleep, and I couldn't imagine having to deal with that as a child because as an adult it's frustrating to deal with when you feel like you have no real like the social skills of a kid, or like you don't have a knowledge base to really know what's happening to you, or why it's happening. I imagine that can be very challenging to deal with as a kid.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you have children, I have 2 of my own. My first was an amazing sleeper since 4 months old, really barely a stress, but when I had my second, I was already in my coursework for my BCBA, and when he was a very young toddler, I was testing and studying for my BCBA. So anybody who's taken any kind of of that nature really understands the demands, and my second one had terrible sleep habits because
Mm,
I just couldn't dedicate myself to being consistent with him. I just couldn't do it. So I have one of each. Neither of my children are on the spectrum, but I had a great sleeper and a terrible sleeper, and it's not fun because if you don't have a child who's sleeping, you're absolutely not sleeping. And so when we're looking at children on the spectrum, the gravity of not sleeping and not getting good sleep for months and years on end has a terrible detrimental impact to the family and to the other siblings in the house. So, I'm the same as you. I grew up and I'm like, I never had a sleep problem. I never even thought about it. I could
yeah.
go on no sleep practically when I was, much younger and I was going to college. And that changes over the course of your life. But if I had to run every day, all day with no sleep, eventually, your own health deteriorates and your own capacity to help the other person deteriorates.
Yeah. So for the caregivers of kids with autism, or learners, people having trouble with sleep, and also for BCBAs listening to this episode, what are some of the key elements of creating a good bedtime routine?
So creating a good bedtime routine, it's something that when I have done like my CEU webinar or even the caregiver webinar that I have, I discuss how it's really like an all day concept. So we do have a good bedtime routine, but supporting that routine actually takes place during the day. So if you're going to have a good bedtime routine, you need to have an age appropriate bedtime. And sometimes, parents just pick a number arbitrarily. I certainly did that myself with my kids. I was like 7:30, I'm done, and
Yeah.
everyone to bed regardless of age, right?
Yeah.
But we do want to be more thoughtful about the time that we go to bed, and that time that we go to bed is determined by our wake time. So, I talk a lot to parents about what time do you consistently need that child up in the morning, and then work backwards the amount of time that they should be sleeping. From that bedtime, we work another hour backwards, and that's the start of your bedtime routine. So once we have like the math figured out, then it comes down to the elements of the routine. So you want the routine itself to be structured to some capacity. It doesn't have to be regimented or militant. They're families and they have usually more than one kid and nothing goes to plan. So we just want the structure to remain same. in terms of the order, but the events in their order can change up.
Mm.
They don't have to do the same thing every night, but they should have an order that makes sense to their child because we want the order to cue the change of events. Um,
Okay.
so we want the child to start understanding the expectation is starting to change and the expectation ends with me going to sleep.
Okay. So
So
so first it's establishing the math based off of the waking hour, and then from then you sort of work backwards to create the routine that can be flexible for each kid, because like you said, parents, multiple kids,
yeah,
can be kind of a crap show trying to get them all into bed at the same exact time.
yeah, and parents are tired and they have other concerns. So, you know, trying to work as flexibly in your schedule, but also keeping an order. So, um, when you're looking at the bedtime routine itself, we want it to have a few elements. We want it to be consistent in terms of the time it starts, about an hour before bedtime. We want it to be free of or as free of electronic devices as possible because those suppress melatonin and we need that to feel the need to go to bed.
Mm,
We want to have lower activity levels. For some of our learners, it's really difficult because they may not have great play skills, they may not have good leisure skills. So, how do we create more calm leading up to bedtime so that we are getting to bed in a better state per se?
mm,
And then we want to make sure that we're cueing expectations. So, you know, usually the start of the bedtime routine is a cue, and then the order is another cue. And then how do we get the child to bed awake and groggy, but with enough sleep pressure that they can learn to fall asleep on their own? So that's, the general elements that parents would want to pay attention to on top of how is their sleep space? So, generally you want the sleep space to be cooler and you need it to be dark and you want to get rid of like some sensory elements, but I tell parents, that works for me and that may not work for your child. So, know your child well enough and know what they are bothered by or what they need in order to create a space. So,
yeah,
if 68 degrees is the general thought, I can't sleep in 68 degrees. I need to be cooler. So my
yeah.
husband always comes in, he's like closing windows on me because I like a cooler space. So knowing your child well enough and how they fall asleep so you can create an environment that works.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I'm the same way with the temperature. Could you give some examples of what it means to cue? Because I just wanna make sure that I have the right idea in my head when I'm talking about it.
Okay. So what I mean by cueing is what signals to the learner that expectations are now changing going forward. So, what we're looking to do is to signal their mind and their body that sleep is coming. So,
Mm,
think about your own routine. When I'm getting ready for bed, even before I realized what I was doing when I went through the certification process, I was doing the same things going to bed. I was primarily getting ready around 8 to 8:30 at night. I was always doing like a facial routine. There was probably a shower. I was then um, getting the kitchen ready at night. And then I was moving to the bedroom. And then I would do some reading or some journaling. I might even just watch TV. But I always had a similar order. And to me, that order became necessary because it helped me get ready for bed. And it signaled to me that I was now expected to go to sleep. So when you're taking that premise and doing the same thing for your child, we're trying to instill a routine that makes sense to that learner. So,
mm,
for several of my parents, I tell them things like help them get ready for the next day. So, can they get their snacks together? Can they put their backpack by the door? Can they make sure they're shutting off the light in the bathroom and then going straight to the bedroom? Like, what are the cues that you're putting in place to help your learner understand that these are the things that lead up to bedtime? And they
mm,
they can be visual cues too, obviously. So, if learners need a visual support, some type of a schedule that they see that it's leading to bed, that can be very effective as well, on top of the cues that occur in the routine.
mm. Are there are there any signs that you may see from a kid during the day that signals that they are not getting good sleep that the parent may be unaware of? Like, let's say, they think their kid is going to bed at a certain time. Maybe they have a PS4 or like one of the handheld things hidden in their room. They're staying up all night doing other things. Are there any signs that maybe aren't the obvious of like, oh, they look tired that may indicate that yeah, your kid is sort of getting away with staying up later?
With some stuff at night.
Yeah. Having
Yeah.
a, you know, a second life or, you know, something like that. They're sort of, pulling the wig over their eyes.
Mhm. Well, I do have, I do work with a lot of, students who are nonverbal, but a lot of students who are and who have great social skills and capacities, and, um, some of the things that as a district, because I work contracted into districts, some of the things that we look at in the district is, emotional dysregulation. How emotional are they? Now, when you're dealing with teenagers, they're emotional regardless. So if you compound poor sleep on top of that, you really have, a missile coming at you each morning. But how emotional are they? Are they quick to anger? So those are maybe some of the subtle signs that we're not getting good sleep. Higher rates of challenging behavior during the day is another sign that there may be some sleep issues going on. So those are some of the ones that maybe aren't as obvious as sticking my head on the desk and passing out in math class,
Mm,
or just kind of zoning out with my eyes open. Those may be more subtle ones that could be attributed to things just like, being a teenager. A lot of parents are pretty well aware, from what I've seen, that their little one is not getting good sleep. And so they'll come to drop off and be like, good luck, up
yeah,
since 1, have fun, don't call me. So, it's fun, it's playful, but it is a warning to the staff that, you're getting my child and he's not really slept well, so he may not be super cooperative today. Um,
yeah.
those types of things.
Yeah, it's like dropping a bomb in enemy territory. You're just like, "Well, here, good luck with this."
It really is. And that's what they say. They open the door, they're like, good luck, and
Yeah,
kinda
just
half kick
throw
the
them
kid
out the
out of the
window.
car, and you're like, okay. Um, but if kids are, coming in, even if they're in a great state, and then they're napping or they're trying to catch little naps, during the day, and they're doing this consistently enough, you probably have a kid who either isn't getting good sleep even though they appear to be sleeping, or you have a kid who maybe isn't getting sleep for whatever reason.
Yeah. What are some common mistakes that parents should avoid or caretakers should avoid when establishing a good bedtime routine? Maybe things that they may think are a good idea, that dogma says to do this, but in reality, it's not great for the kid.
I think that, in general, most people will agree that, if you have access to your phones or your tablets or your computer screens, in the later evenings going towards bedtime, you're not doing yourself any favors, right? So it's hard because if you have a child, again, who doesn't have a lot of skills and this is how they relax, that is going to be difficult for a parent. So that becomes like, how do we build skills separately? But, access to the screens in general, people agree, you shouldn't really do this. You need to relax and get that stuff away because it's not helping your hormones.
Yeah,
The other thing that kind of, you can go either way, is the uncle, play thing in the living room where he's like hyping up your kids and he's getting the wiggles out and he's like roughhousing. And then you take a super excited child and you're like, time for bed. That's not helpful. I never found that to
yeah,
be helpful to like get it out. If anything, my kids were more excited. Maybe they did crash
yeah,
eventually, but they were probably fighting me on the way to bed. So that might be something. Um Sometimes, I didn't find personally putting my kids into like a lavender bath to be super helpful, but a lot of my families that I work with do say that a warm bath and a warm shower is helpful. I found it to have the opposite effect
yeah,
for my kids. So again, like some of these things that could go either way, like, a warm bath, that might be something that doesn't work for them. But those are the types of things that, the screen time and caffeine, and caffeine is hidden in things like chocolate. So if you have a child who maybe is a picky eater and sustains a little bit more on the snacking, or they don't have more regimented meal times and they're snacking and eating things like chocolate, um, if they're drinking, things like a soda, that would be terrible too. but, like, where is the caffeine hidden, and how is their diet affecting their ability to, maybe generate good sleep too? Because if they're intaking caffeine, they're not gonna easily go to sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, the bath thing is interesting because I feel like I didn't really appreciate a good bath until I became an adult. Like I can't see myself, just like curling up with a Dr. Seuss book at 8 years old, lighting some candles and just relaxing in a bath and telling my mom, give me 20 minutes. I'll be in at the end of this chapter. Just
Exactly. Yeah. The bath for my kids always, like, ended up in, like, a sea of water and excitement, and it just didn't work for me.
yeah,
But I have families who say that it is very helpful because, it's not only teaching a functional skill, but it's keeping their ability to keep their child occupied through that hour leading up to bedtime in a way that is conducive, so they find that to be helpful, so I always add that as an element, even though I didn't have good success with it.
yeah. Are there any types of routines that work on average better for boys versus girls, or does it not matter?
I haven't found that. It's the elements and how they approach the routines that make a difference. Um, I do find that a lot of my family struggle with what to put in the routine. Um, so I always tell families, like, look at things like chores, look at things such as leisure skills. I even encourage, for several of my learners who really don't have leisure skills, it's hard to fill an hour without an iPad. So, if the weather permits, I always encourage, like, start to teach taking a walk, and get out, in the, like, 2 hours before bedtime and start getting exposure to that natural light, to that fresh air if they're not gonna walk, maybe a wagon ride if they're young, or some other type of, supports to get them to be a participant in
Mhm.
the activity, but really, how can we fill the time in the absence of an iPad?
Yeah,
And for a lot of my kids, that's a tall order, so I speak a lot to families about it's not just about building a routine, it's about building the skill set to support the routine too. So what
yeah.
skills are they deficient in or, lagging in that we have to pay attention to in order to make a routine and sleep more probable with less challenging behavior?
You recently put out a video on YouTube called, I believe it was "Sleep as a Setting Event."
Yeah.
What does a setting event mean, and why is it so important to address sleep as one?
So that really is, if you're looking at challenging behavior during the day, then a setting event is going to increase the probability that that behavior will occur. So, a setting event can be like if I'm hungry, that increases the probability that I'm going to engage in behaviors to get food. If I'm not hungry, I'm not going to engage in behaviors to get food. So, that's how I kind of bring it for parents so that they understand what that means. That setting event is it's increasing the probability that you are going to or not going to get better sleep. So, how do we address sleep as a setting event for challenging behaviors? Is what that video is entailing. So, if we're looking at challenging behaviors during the daytime and we're not at least having a conversation on how sleep is impacting the learner, then we might be missing an entire area that is increasing the probability that they are melting down, crying, engaging in self abuse, engaging in aggression. We want to be able to tackle that, but we also need to tackle the fact that maybe they're not sleeping well. And that's part of the puzzle that we need to resolve, not just what's happening directly at the moment that a behavior happens.
Yeah. So you're identifying things that you can sort of either add or take away to the routine to make it as hard as possible for them to get bad sleep. Like you're trying to like set them up to have like if you don't have a good sleep, it's we did all we could. Like hopefully it sort of works itself out.
Yeah, and so, because I'm coming at it from a behavioral standpoint, I'm looking at strategies then and events that I can have an effect on. So that's separate from the medical component. So
Mm,
I had a student last year. She just graduated. So last year where she went to bed on her own. We got her to fall asleep on her own. She had a good routine, but every single morning she woke up like I don't know, like she was cranky. We couldn't
Yeah.
get her out of bed. It was a fight every single morning before school. So even though we technically remediated any type of problem behavior and we were very sure that the child was sleeping through the night, it became more of an issue of, is there something medically happening where she's not really getting restorative sleep? So that family was going through a sleep study at the time. I haven't spoken to them in a little bit, but they were going through a sleep study at the time to see how she was when she slept. Because if we're doing everything and she's getting the right hours of sleep and there's no sleep dependencies in play and we've dealt with any challenging behaviors around bedtime and during the night, and she's still waking up, wanting to, like, argue and fight everybody, then how can we still have to drag this kid out of bed? So that's something that really needs to be looked at medically. Like, she may not just be getting restorative sleep, and then that is definitely out of my scope of practice, but I can help, like, parents to
Yeah.
kind of recognize that there may be something else happening.
Yeah, it's like if you've tried everything behaviorally and that's still not working, then that may be a sign that something medical is going on.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and there's also the caveat that a lot of the learners I work with are also on medications. So, how does medication come into play? How does the timing of the medication affect their ability to fall asleep or to stay asleep? So, really, those conversations the parents have to have with their the physicians and their providers so that they understand what is a reasonable expectation? We can do so much, but if medication timing is going to affect certain elements of their sleep, or if the medication itself is going to affect their sleep, there may be nothing we can do about that. So, parents, I do want them to have like realistic expectations of outcomes because just
Yeah.
because we do all of these things on the front end and all of these things during the school day and all of these things to increase skill acquisition, that doesn't mean that you're gonna have completely restful nights if you have medical components involved.
Yeah. You've also spoken about the importance of working on the skills to learn to reduce those problem behaviors that you mentioned, and you put out a really insightful video where you talked about the relinquishing, transitioning, leisure toleration. Can you talk about those skills and how developing them can make such an impact on sleep?
I love talking about those skills. It's all I do. So, um, it really came from the premise that if we're going to teach sleep, what skills need to be in play in order to get that to happen. So a lot of the time, I would say like 80, 90% of the time, when I'm working with staff who are working with students or if I'm working with families, it always comes down to the same several skill sets that seem to be either missing completely or not fully developed or not generalized. And things like being able to relinquish things that you really, really love to maybe something that is a less preferred is like
Mm,
a top contender. So, how easily can the child give up something that they love or transition from something they really enjoy to something that they maybe don't enjoy as much or maybe they view as an outright task to them. So, how do we develop the skill of tolerating that piece? I have several kids who part of the sleep plan that we have in place is tolerating not being velcro to their mother, because how can we fall asleep on our own if mom is always stuck in the bed, right? We wanna
mm,
get to sleep on our own. So part of that is being able to tolerate time away. And we can't just do that at night because it's quite frankly unfair. Like we're velcroed all day long, but at night in the dark, I'm not with you anymore. And that just increases
yeah,
anxiety for a couple of my learners. So we work during the day to practice the skill of I'm gonna be right back, hang out, and I'm going to leave. And then I teach parents to do that in short intervals and to come back and reinforce the behavior of being able to be okay for a few seconds, a few minutes without mom. And then we transfer that to the bed. We transfer that skill to the time where we need it to really be in effect. So those are ones that we're constantly working on, and I have the staff working on that in the daytime as well to not only help the parent but really to help the staff members because how are we going to get to gym or leave gym if I really like it to come to, I don't know, math, which is less than exciting.
Yeah.
We have to be able to have that skill set in play. And then a lot of some of the other skills I really focus on, like you had said, was leisure skills. If we don't have leisure skills, then what are we doing with our time that's not a computer or an iPad or so we really want to spend some time, even if it needs to be supported in the bedtime routine and mom or grandma or the caregiver has to stay, but at least being able to do other things and hopefully find value in those other activities also helps to lead us to good bedtime, but it also helps to create hobbies as they get older, things that they might enjoy engaging in or they might enjoy to do, as a career or a job.
Yeah, I feel like that's the leisure is something I feel lucky to have not grown up with a cell phone and not having a cell phone until, you know, freshman, sophomore year of high school was that we had to devise ways, yeah, in a group of friends to occupy time
Mhm.
that did not involve screens. And, sometimes that meant just, forming a bike gang and riding around town and, playing football or whatever. And I feel empathetic to kids today who grow up learning that all leisure has to involve some sort of digital technology when in reality there's so much that you could do that doesn't involve a screen.
Yeah, and depending on the child, of course, right? A child with autism, the use of the screen could absolutely be prohibiting social skill development and social interactions and friendships and so forth. So, you know, it's not eliminating them, right? Because there's value to these as well in terms of teaching components and they're a thread that runs through all kids. So if you're aware of, a particular game, then you can join in conversations of other kids who are discussing those games and you might be able to join like, forums or so there's value to it. But, when you're in recess on the playground, no one has a phone and a screen. So what is our learner doing during that time, and do they have the skills to even join those? So, like, going beyond sleep, developing these skills, if we can spend time developing them, it opens up um so many other opportunities for our learners. So, there's a lot of value to that and it's hard. It's hard. So, I'm empathetic to that with families because I have two kids and I have a 14-year-old and yeah, he would like to do that 95% of his time. So it is like that encouragement always to do something else. So when I
Yeah.
talk to families and I, do these, those YouTube channels, I'm trying to encourage people to not forget that part of going to bed is also having skills that help us lead to bedtime.
For parents and caretakers who may be listening to this and they're saying, I'm pretty sure my kid is having sleep hygiene problems. They're listening to some of the symptoms and behavioral problems going on during the day, and they're pretty sure they could link it back to sleep, but they're not sure what the first step is. What is the right direction, or what's a logical first step for a parent to take that maybe feels overwhelmed with helping their child have better sleep habits?
That's a good question. So I think keep it simple, right? So let's start from what we can do first. When you're looking at any problem, you could probably branch off into multitudes of things to do. So for parents who are a little overwhelmed with the process, just start with what's going well. You know, um, if anybody hooks into my Instagram, I have like free resources. They're intended for BCBAs, but they really are useful for families. And one of them is a reflection sheet. So what is going well in the bedtime routine? Start to write those things out so that you can see that it's not all problems. Sometimes when you're dealing with problematic behavior, the entire thing looks like a wash, but there's usually points of success even in a routine that feels like it's not going well, or even in a bedtime or at night, even if it feels like a wash. So start to write out what does go well. And then also write out where you need improvements to occur. So those are like first steps that you can either discuss with a BCBA that you have on staff, either in the district or if you're running a home program. If your kid's in, a pre-K, um, then you might be able to access the staff there and start having a conversation that way. What you can actionably do first is take a good assessment of your bedtime routine. Like, do I have a decent bedtime for my child? Did I arbitrarily pick it, or do I now know when to start the bedtime? And then what is the order that I have to go in? So, where can I start to make improvements in that respect? For a good majority of my parents, when we tackle the bedtime routine, the time leading up to bedtime, for a good majority of my parents, it remediates a large amount of the problem behavior they're dealing with. They might still deal with some like nighttime waking, like once in the at night or twice at night, but the fight to bedtime and the falling asleep part and the getting the parents out of the bedtime, we're able to remediate that by looking at the dependencies, shaping that, and structuring a good bedtime routine. So I think that there's great value in doing the simplistic part as well. It doesn't have to be I have to revamp everything. It could be, let me just look at what I achieve by making one subtle change here first.
Mm. Is there any typical timeline that you see kids making adjustments when parents come in and they try to alter their habits, where maybe a parent says, I'm limiting screen time, I'm doing all these things, but it's been 3 weeks and I'm not seeing changes. Or maybe another kid that the parents know is moving along faster. Is every kid typically different, or is there like a time where you say, okay, well, if it's past this amount of time at stage one, you should, probably try something else?
So it's definitely going to be very child specific. But I will say that it varies. So I have parents who we've made adjustments to the bedtime routine, and within 2 or 3 days, they're no longer having problem behavior. That's probably more likely the parent who's not getting overall problem behavior through the night and everything else. They're just fighting the bedtime routine. They're needing extra time with mom. Mom is laying down. If we can remediate that, we remediate a lot. And so I have parents who are like, after 3 sessions, we're not talking about it anymore because we've remediated the problem just by adjusting the bedtime routine. I have other families where they're dealing with more complex dependencies, like you can't leave me, and we have to work a lot on pre-teaching the skill and then get it into the bedtime routine and then fade the parent out. And then that is only going to go as fast as the child allows, and as consistent as the parents are. So if we're not practicing the skill, like, I usually say like a couple of times, 10-minute blocks, 5-minute blocks here and there, but a couple of times on the weekend. And, if they're home from school, if we're not investing the time to practice the skills, then we can't be expecting the behavior to change rapidly. So, there has to be an honesty on the parents' part of, yes, I am doing something towards the end goal, not just at bedtime.
Mm,
So for some of my families, even when they do work on it, because there's such levels of high anxiety in their child, this is taking them longer. And for other kids, we've remediated successfully early on the problem behavior of not falling asleep, or, just the bad habit of like, I fall asleep on the couch and then I fall asleep in my bed and then I fall asleep in mom's bed, and organizing the family to do better that way. But they're struggling with the nighttime wakings because there's a medical component also happening. So it really is all over the board, but I will say that the structure of the bedtime routine is something that, regardless of the students I've worked with, all of the families have had better outcomes when we've tackled that.
mm. Before we start to end off, are there any main takeaways that you'd like to leave parents and caretakers with, or maybe anything uh anything foundational that we should have covered that we didn't, as we start to end off this episode?
I think if they can look at it as shifting their mindset to think of sleep as a skill they have to teach. Because we look at everything else, right? How do we tie our shoe? How are we going to get the child to have an expanded repertoire of food? How are they going to, um, get dressed? How are they going to ride a bike? So we teach all of these other things, but we don't really talk about teaching this skill. And knowing how to go to sleep is maybe more natural for us because as neurotypical people, we're cueing into the fact that the sun is setting and it got dark. We know that that means it's getting ready to go to bed. But some of our learners don't cue in on those types of things. So we have to teach what this means that we're getting ready for bed. So I think that if parents or clinicians start to have a takeaway of this is something that I can impact to some degree and I can teach skills around, then we at least change the format of how we approach sleep instead of just he doesn't sleep because he has autism and he's never going to sleep. Can we make an impact to improve that? That's what I think the main takeaway should be.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Taking a more athletic approach to it, sort of like you wouldn't expect a kid to know how to do a crossover unless you did dozens to
Training.
hundreds of repetitions showing them how to do a crossover on the basketball courts. It sounds like it's a similar thing with sleep, where you the more repetitions they get, the more they're gonna have those foundations ingrained into their sleep habits.
Yeah, and again, I'm coming at it from a behavioral perspective, so
Yeah,
I'm looking at it as what can we teach? What skills can we develop? How can we support sleep during the day? How can we support sleep in the routine? Um, and then, there are other aspects like how are we balancing the circadian rhythm? If they're getting up, are they getting sunshine during the day? Are they getting exercise during the day? So there's a lot of other elements that just come from a biological standpoint but, if that's already in play, then how can we help them be more successful by teaching them some of the skills necessary and reducing problem behavior, which then reduces their physical activity leading up to bedtime?
yeah.
Because you
I
can't
know.
for bed if you're ticked off that you lost your iPad.
Yeah, exactly. I know there are a lot of people listening to this that will want to follow up on this conversation with checking out resources and your page. So please tell people where they can follow you, where they can get any resources that you create. How can they keep up with all things Gabrielle Carmody?
I think the easiest place is to find me on Instagram at sleeptight_Gabby. In there, you'll find links to my Thinkific school. It's a platform where I do upload resources that are free as well as webinars for caregivers and clinicians. And then there you'll also find the link for my YouTube account. It's just Gabrielle Carmody, nothing special in the name. And there I'm just uploading videos as I can that are related to sleep because, I do work full time in a district and have two kids.
Yeah.
So I'm not proficient with getting them up every other, day, but definitely trying monthly to put on new content there as well.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to hop on the podcast. I know people will find this super insightful. I'm going to link everything that you just mentioned to the episode. And yeah, thank you again. This has been a very informative episode.
You are more than welcome. I'm very happy to join you.
Thank you for listening to the AAK podcast. To keep up with all things AAK, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at AAK Cares. For any questions or comments about the podcast, you can reach out to me through my email, which is linked in the podcast description. We appreciate you tuning in. Until next time.